The letter didn't just say no. It said her mother's dignity would disrupt the neighborhood's integrity. That was their first and last mistake. Lena Washington traced the embossed letterhead of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association with a thumb that was still smudged with potting soil. The paper felt heavy, expensive, each fiber infused with a self-importance that made her stomach clench. Outside, the manicured lawns of the subdivision were a perfect, unbroken sea of green, a testament to order, to rules, to a kind of peace that felt suffocating. Inside, her mother, Eleanor, sat in her worn armchair by the living room window, her world shrunk to the dimensions of the glass pane. Eleanor had once commanded courtrooms, a paralegal whose mind was a steel trap of precedents and clauses. Her voice, though weakened now by the strokes that had stolen her mobility, still held the quiet timbre of authority. But the 3 concrete steps leading from their front porch to the walkway might as well have been a cliff. They were a daily monument to her imprisonment. For 3 months, Eleanor hadn't felt the sun on her face without the strained, humiliating effort of Lena and a hired aide practically carrying her down. Her wheelchair sat folded in the hall like a dormant promise. So Lena had applied. She had filled out the forms in triplicate, submitted diagrams for a simple, tasteful wooden ramp, sourced a contractor who promised to match the stain to the porch railings. It was a request born of love, a plea for the simplest of freedoms, the ability for her mother to leave her own home. And this was the answer. She read the words again, letting them sink in like poison. While we sympathize with the personal circumstances, the board has a fiduciary duty to uphold the aesthetic harmony of the community. The proposed modification, as designed, would constitute a significant disruption to the neighborhood's visual integrity. Therefore, the request is denied. Visual integrity. The phrase was so clean, so sterile. It was a surgeon's blade used to perform a butcher's job. It was a polite way of saying her mother's disability was an eyesore. It was a way of saying their quiet, desperate need was ugly. Lena folded the letter, the crisp paper creasing under the force of her fingers. She looked over at her mother, who was watching her with knowing eyes. Eleanor had seen this kind of language before, in deeds and bylaws written decades ago, words polished to a high shine to conceal their rotten core. "What is it, baby?" Eleanor's voice was a soft rasp. Lena forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Just a formality, Mama. They need some more information." It was the first lie she had told her mother about the ramp. It would not be the last. She tucked the letter into her pocket, the sharp edges pressing against her thigh. It felt like a weapon, or maybe a declaration of war. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table and drafted her appeal, not as a request but as a demand. She didn't know it yet, but she was no longer just fighting for a ramp. She was fighting for the meaning of the word home. The Oak Creek Community Center smelled of pine sol and quiet desperation. It was a bland beige room where the rules of suburban life were forged under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. At the front, the 5 members of the HOA board sat behind a long folding table, a tribunal of polo shirts and sensible shoes. In the center sat Mr. Abernathy, the president, a man whose posture seemed permanently stiffened by the weight of his own perceived importance. His face was a mask of pleasant neutrality, the kind of expression that made you feel unreasonable for having a problem. Lena stood before them, her hands gripping a folder filled with documents. She had her mother's doctor's notes, letters from physical therapists, even a petition signed by her immediate neighbors who had no issue with the ramp. She had practiced her speech, edited it, stripped it of the anger that simmered just beneath her skin, leaving only the cool, hard facts. She waited as they droned through the minutes of the last meeting, a litany of approved fence heights and violations for unkempt flower beds. When her name was finally called, she stepped forward. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here to appeal the denial of our request for a wheelchair accessibility ramp at 1422 Sycamore Lane." Mr. Abernathy gave a tight, sympathetic smile. "Yes, Miss Washington, we have your file." He didn't look at it. He looked at her. "As you know, my mother, Eleanor, is unable to leave our home without significant assistance. The front steps are a barrier. A ramp isn't a luxury, it's a medical necessity. It's about her safety, her quality of life." She laid out the photos of the proposed design. The wood was the same as the porch. The slope was gentle. It was unobtrusive, professional. "We've taken great care to ensure the design is as discreet as possible to be in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic." She used their words, hoping it would bridge the gap. It didn't. Abernathy cleared his throat. "Miss Washington, we appreciate your presentation. We truly do. However, the bylaws are quite clear. Section 4, Article C, subsection Roman 2, prohibits structural additions to the forward-facing facade of any residence without unanimous board approval." "But this isn't a sunroom, it's a ramp," Lena countered, trying to keep the frustration from her voice. "There are federal laws, the Fair Housing Act." "We are well aware of the FHA," Abernathy cut in, his pleasant tone fraying just slightly. "Our legal counsel has advised us that our bylaws are fully compliant. We are not denying your mother accommodation. We are simply enforcing the architectural standards that every resident agrees to upon purchasing a home in Oak Creek. It's what maintains our property values." Property values. There it was. The cold, hard calculus that weighed her mother's freedom against a few dollars on a real estate listing. A woman on the board with a pearl necklace and a tight perm chimed in. "Have you considered using the garage entrance? Perhaps a lift system could be installed there out of sight." "Our garage is at the back of the house," Lena explained, her patience wearing thin. For her to get to the front yard, she'd have to navigate a narrow, uneven path. It's more dangerous than the steps. "Well," Abernathy said with a sigh, as if Lena were being deliberately obtuse, "these are the challenges. The board's primary responsibility is to the community as a whole, not to the particular needs of one household. To make an exception for one is to open the door for all manner of modifications. It's a slippery slope." He looked around at the other board members, who nodded in solemn agreement. They weren't seeing a woman fighting for her mother. They were seeing a crack in their perfect, orderly world. They were seeing a threat to their integrity. He gave her that same tight smile again. "Your appeal is noted, Miss Washington. The board will take it under advisement. We'll inform you of our final decision in writing." It was a dismissal, a public pat on the head. Lena stood there for a moment, the folder in her hand suddenly feeling 100 pounds heavier. The room was silent. She looked at their faces, indifferent, resolved, hidden behind the shield of their precious bylaws. They weren't just saying no. They were making her invisible. She turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the beige room. Behind her, she heard Abernathy's voice, clear and untroubled. Next on the agenda, the seasonal color palette for the front entrance. The official denial came 2 days later. It was shorter this time, the language more blunt. The final line felt like a shove. "Further appeals on this matter will not be considered." That evening, Lena sat at the kitchen table, staring at a list of attorneys. The consultation fees alone were more than she could afford. She had drained most of her savings moving back home, quitting her job in Chicago to become a full-time caregiver. The numbers on the page swam before her eyes, each digit a brick in the wall they were building around her and her mother. The soft whir of the wheelchair announced Eleanor's arrival. She wheeled herself to the edge of the table and placed a frail, wrinkled hand over Lena's. Her knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but her touch was firm. "What is it, Lena girl?" Lena couldn't hide it anymore. The facade crumbled. She pushed the letter across the table. Eleanor didn't need to read it. She saw it in her daughter's face, in the tension in her shoulders, in the glint of unshed tears. "They said no again, Mama." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her own hands resting in her lap. Hands that had once typed 100 words a minute, that had held Lena as a baby, that had signed the mortgage for this very house. Now they could not even open the front door. "Then we let it be," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. Lena's head snapped up. "What? No, we're not giving up." "Baby, look at you," Eleanor said, her eyes full of a pain that was deeper than her own physical ailment. "You haven't had a full night's sleep in months. You're stretched so thin you're about to snap. I can't be the cause of this." Her voice broke. "I won't be a burden to you." The word hung in the air between them. Burden. It was the one thing Lena had never wanted her to feel. "You are not a burden," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion as she reached across the table, grabbing her mother's hand. "You are my mother. You are my home. Do you hear me?" But Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the window, on the world outside that was no longer hers. "This house, it's turning into a cage, and I'm the one who's trapped you in here with me. Don't fight for this ramp, Lena. It's not worth it. It's not worth what it's doing to you." Lena felt a cold knot of despair tighten in her gut. The HOA rejection was one thing. But this, her mother's surrender, her feeling of being a weight on her own child, was a wound far deeper. Abernathy and his board hadn't just denied a ramp. They had attacked the very foundation of her mother's spirit. They had made a woman who had fought for others her whole life feel worthless. And in that moment, Lena's fight became something else. It was no longer just about wood and screws and the right to feel the sun. It was about reclaiming her mother's honor. It was about proving that she was not a burden but the very reason for the fight. She would not let them win. Not now. Not ever. She would burn through every dollar, every ounce of energy she had left, before she let her mother believe she was not worth fighting for. A formal warning arrived a week later, delivered by certified mail. It was from the HOA law firm, a crisp, intimidating letter threatening daily fines for failure to maintain property in accordance with community standards, citing the collection of fallen leaves near their front steps, leaves Lena hadn't had the time or the heart to rake. It was a clear message: "We are watching you. Fall in line." Lena was reading it on the porch, the words blurring with rage and helplessness, when a voice startled her. "That man is a tyrant in a polo shirt." She looked up. Mrs. Gable, the elderly white woman from next door, stood at the edge of her own pristine lawn, holding a pair of gardening shears. They had been neighbors for a year, but had exchanged little more than polite waves. Mrs. Gable nodded toward the letter in Lena's hand. "It's from Abernathy, isn't it?" Lena just nodded, unable to speak. "He sent my son a warning last year for putting up a basketball hoop for my grandson," Mrs. Gable said, her voice sharp with remembered indignation. "Said it lowered the tone of the neighborhood. The boy was heartbroken." She took a few steps closer, her expression softening. "I saw you at the meeting the other night. What they're doing to you, it's not right. It's never been about the rules with him. It's about control." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a creased white envelope. "This isn't much," she said, pressing it into Lena's hand. "For the lawyer." Lena opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Gable just shook her head. "Maya Leaner was the first person to welcome us to this street 20 years ago. Brought over a warm pecan pie. She deserves to be able to sit on her own porch." Inside the envelope was $200 in cash. It wasn't just money. It was a crack of light in a very dark room. It was the first sign that she wasn't entirely alone. That afternoon, buoyed by a fragile new hope, Lena made one more call. The name had been given to her by a friend of a friend, David Chen, a young attorney who had recently left a large corporate firm to start his own practice. His office was a small, cluttered space above a bakery, smelling faintly of sugar and ambition. David was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a barely contained energy. He listened intently as Lena told her story, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to quiet outrage. He looked at the denial letters, the threatening warnings, the photos of a Leaner staring out the window. When she was finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. "They cited visual integrity?" he asked, a disbelieving smile playing on his lips. "That's the legal equivalent of 'because I said so.' It's a shield they use to hide behind when they don't have a legitimate reason." "Can we fight it?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Fight it?" David leaned forward, his eyes alight. "Miss Washington, we're going to dismantle it. Their case is a house of cards built on discriminatory pretext. The Fair Housing Act is very clear about reasonable accommodations for disabilities. They're banking on you not having the resources or the will to call their bluff." He looked down at his legal pad, then back at her. "I'll be honest, this will be a fight, but it's the right one. I'll take your case. We'll work out a payment plan, something you can manage. I started this practice to help people like you, not to bill IORs to faceless corporations." For the first time in weeks, Lena felt the tight knot in her chest loosen. She saw in David not just a lawyer, but an ally, someone who saw the injustice as clearly as she did. As she left his office, the smell of baking bread filling the air, Lena felt a shift in the wind. Mrs. Gable's kindness, David's conviction. They were small things, but they were real. The HOA had built a wall around her, but now she could see a few cracks, and she was determined to tear it down, brick by bureaucratic brick. David Chen didn't believe in fighting battles in the dark. He believed in shining a light so bright it made the cockroaches scatter. That weekend, he drafted a concise, anonymized post about the case and shared it on the Oak Creek community's unofficial social media page. He didn't name Lena or her mother, simply referring to a long-time resident and disabled senior being denied a medically necessary ramp on the grounds of aesthetic harmony. The post landed like a spark on dry tinder. Within hours, the comments section was flooded. "This is outrageous. Who are they to decide this?" Then the stories started to emerge, a trickle at first, then a flood. "The HOA fined us $50 a day because our daughter's playset was visible from the street. They told my husband he had to remove the vegetable garden from our front yard, said it was not in keeping with the neighborhood's landscaping profile. They tried to stop my partner and I from flying a small pride flag during Pride Month, said it was an unapproved sign. It became clear that Mr. Abernathy's reign of integrity was, in fact, a long campaign of petty tyranny, disproportionately affecting anyone who deviated from his narrow, sterile vision of suburbia. Lena watched the digital storm unfold from her kitchen table, a strange mix of vindication and sorrow washing over her. She wasn't alone. So many others had been cowed into silence. The online outrage caught the attention of Sarah Jenkins, a young reporter for a local news affiliate. She was hungry, ambitious, and had a keen eye for stories of injustice that larger outlets overlooked. She sent a message to David, who, after consulting with Lena, agreed to an interview. The segment that aired on the Tuesday evening news was masterful in its simplicity. It wasn't an attack, it was a portrait. The camera lingered on Alina's hands, folded in her lap. It showed her looking longingly out the window at the neighborhood she had lived in for 2 decades. It showed the 3 simple concrete steps, shot from a low angle to make them look like a mountain. Then, it showed Lena, speaking not with anger but with a quiet, heartbreaking strength. "All I want," she said to the camera, "is for my mother to feel the warmth of the sun on her skin again. To sit on her own porch. Is that too much to ask of a neighborhood?" The segment didn't mention Abernathy by name, but it didn't have to. The final shot was a slow pan across the pristine, identical houses of Oak Creek, the phrase "visual integrity" superimposed on the screen. The effect was immediate. David's GoFundMe page, created to help with legal fees, exploded. Donations poured in, not just from Oak Creek but from all over the city. People included messages of support. "We're standing with you. My father was in a wheelchair. Keep fighting." Show them what integrity really means. The pressure on the HOA board became immense. Their phones rang off the hook. Abernathy, who had believed he could squash Lena's appeal with a few sternly worded letters, now found himself at the center of a public relations nightmare. He saw the news segment not as a plea for compassion, but as a personal attack. In his mind, Lena Washington wasn't a daughter fighting for her mother. She was an insurgent, threatening the orderly world he had so carefully curated. He hunkered down, refusing to comment, believing the storm would pass. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the fight. He thought it was about a ramp, but now it was about the soul of a community. The night of the next HOA meeting, the beige community center was unrecognizable. Every chair was filled. People stood along the walls, their arms crossed, their faces set with a grim resolve. There was Mrs. Gable, flanked by her son and grandson. There were the couple who had been told to tear up their vegetable garden. There was the young intern from the news station, her phone out, recording. It wasn't a meeting, it was a reckoning. Lena walked in with David at her side. A quiet ripple went through the crowd as people nodded to her, their eyes conveying a message of solidarity. She took a seat at the front, directly facing the board. Mr. Abernathy, looking pale and drawn, banged his gavel. "This meeting will come to order," he announced, his voice lacking its usual confident boom. He tried to stick to the agenda, but the crowd was restless. "We're here to talk about the ramp," a man shouted from the back. Abernathy's face tightened. "That issue has been decided by the board. Then maybe it's time we decided on a new board." Another voice called out, followed by a wave of applause. David stood up, calm amidst the chaos. "Mr. Abernathy, my client, Miss Lena Washington, is here, but she's not alone tonight." He gestured to the packed room. "This community has some questions for you." David didn't just argue the finer points of the Fair Housing Act, though he did, citing precedent and federal statutes with surgical precision. He did something far more devastating. He put the HOA entire pattern of behavior on trial. This board has repeatedly used vague, subjective bylaws concerning aesthetics and integrity to deny reasonable requests and levy punitive fines, David declared, his voice ringing through the room. "Let's talk about the case of the Martins," he said, pointing to the couple who had lost their garden. "Their request was denied because, and I quote from your letter, vegetable patches are inconsistent with the ornamental horticulture profile of Oak Creek. What does that even mean?" He went on, case after case. The basketball hoop. The pride flag. The family of color who were told the color they painted their front door was not on the pre-approved palette, while their white neighbor's identical color went without comment. He painted a portrait of a board that wasn't upholding standards, but enforcing a rigid, exclusionary, and, yes, discriminatory conformity. With every example, Abernathy shrank a little more in his chair. His power had always been in the quiet, one-on-one intimidation of a formal letter, in the closed-door meetings where he could control the narrative. He was completely unprepared for a public trial by his own community. "The law requires you to make reasonable accommodations," David concluded, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "It does not allow you to decide that a person's disability is an affront to your property values. It does not allow you to use integrity as a code word for who you think does and does not belong." He placed a thick file on the table in front of him. "This is a formal petition, signed by 157 homeowners in this community. It demands an immediate vote on Miss Washington's ramp, and it demands a full, independent review of this board's bylaws and past rulings." The room was dead silent. Abernathy stared at the file as if it were a snake. His authority, built on a foundation of arbitrary rules and the silent compliance of his neighbors, had been utterly and completely demolished. There was nowhere left for him to hide. The community he claimed to be protecting was now demanding he answer to them. The vote was a formality, a public surrender. Abernathy stared down at the table, his face ashen, as he called for the motion to approve the ramp for 1422 Sycamore Lane. One by one, the other board members, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation, voted. "Aye, aye, aye, aye." The room held its breath, all eyes on Abernathy. He knew he was beaten. Every path had been cut off. He muttered the word so low it was almost swallowed by the silence of the room. "Aye." A wave of quiet, powerful applause filled the room. Lena closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She felt David's hand on her shoulder, a gentle squeeze of victory. But it wasn't over. Before Abernathy could move to the next item, Mrs. Gable stood up, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'd like to make a new motion," she announced. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the presidency of Mr. Abernathy." A second voice boomed. "I second that motion." The room erupted. Abernathy looked up, his face a mask of pure shock. This was not a defeat, it was an exile. The vote was a landslide. The man who had judged so many was now judged by all, and he was found wanting. He sat there, stripped of his title, his power, his precious integrity, as the community he had tried to mold into his own image began to remake itself without him. The revenge was not loud or violent. It was quiet, procedural, and absolute. It wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about changing the very laws of the land. 2 weeks later, on a bright Saturday morning, the sound of saws and hammers filled the air at 1422 Sycamore Lane. But it wasn't a hired construction crew. It was Mrs. Gable's son, a contractor by trade, leading a small team of volunteers. It was David Chen, tool belt strapped awkwardly over his dress pants. It was the Martin family, the ones who had lost their garden, now happily measuring planks of wood. It was a community build. Lena moved between them, a pitcher of lemonade in her hand, her face glowing with a light that had been absent for months. She was no longer a warrior, just a daughter, a neighbor, a friend. From the open doorway, Alina watched, her wheelchair positioned so she could see everything. She wasn't just watching them build a ramp, she was watching them build a bridge. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. By late afternoon, it was done. A simple, sturdy wooden ramp, smelling of fresh-cut pine and community spirit. It stood not as a symbol of a bitter fight, but as a testament to the love that had won it. Lena walked inside and gently wheeled her mother out onto the porch. She paused at the top of the ramp, her hand resting on Alina's shoulder. "Ready, Mama," Alina nodded, her grip tight on the armrests. Slowly, carefully, Lena guided the wheelchair down the gentle slope. The wheels rolled smoothly, quietly. When they reached the bottom, they were on the walkway, on level ground. Alina was outside. Lena knelt beside the chair. Alina reached out, her frail hand finding Lena's. She didn't speak. She just closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and for the first time in nearly a year, felt the pure, uncomplicated warmth of the afternoon sun on her face. She breathed it in, a long, slow breath of freedom. Some walkways aren't built with wood and nails. They're built with courage, and they lead to more than just a front door.